The saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. And well, that's what's happening in Sudan. Last episode, we talked about some of the incredible feats that the emergency response rooms have been able to accomplish since the beginning of the war. But what's actually incredible is that they were able to accomplish anything at all, given the overwhelming amount of challenges and obstacles that they've had to face. Let's start with the obvious. It's a war, one in which civilians have been in the direct line of fire with little to no protection. We're talking airstrikes, bombing, mass looting, home raids, you name it, they've been exposed to it. And if they miraculously manage to survive all of that, then they also have to contend with hunger and thirst, disease, homelessness. We're talking Oscar award-winning, everything everywhere all at once levels of danger. Now you might be thinking,
well, what does this have to do with the ERR volunteers? They're aid workers. Surely they enjoy some sort of protection by international law.
And I'm gonna stop you right there. Because yes, international law does afford civilians like medical personnel, journalists, and aid workers special protection. But international law has not factored into this war in Sudan. In fact, no rule of law has really. Civilians have more often than not been direct targets. And since emergency response room volunteers are civilians, you get it. But there's also another layer to that. The emergency response rooms have been at the forefront of the humanitarian response since the first bullet was fired. And arguably, they have the most direct access to communities, being that they are part of those same communities. But technically, they're not considered aid workers. Yeah, I know. The reality is that at the international level, there's been a lot of back and forth about the quote-unquote legitimacy of these groups. Let me explain. In order for large-scale aid organizations like the UN to work in a country, they have to get government approval. And Sudan has had a very contentious relationship with aid agencies, including during this war. In fact, it's one of the many reasons that humanitarian organizations have had a hard time getting workers on the ground and accessing communities in need. As the head of one agency described it,
Sudan continues to present some of the toughest conditions for humanitarian access in the entire world.
Thanks to, among other things,
bureaucratic obstructionism mastered over decades of practice.
Bars. So without sufficient access to the ground, the next best thing is to collaborate with local entities. Logically, you'd immediately think of the emergency response rooms, right? Ironically, aid agencies are also known for their bureaucracy and notorious for having painfully rigid systems that don't like deviation or flexibility. For example, they require that the entities they collaborate with to be nationally registered. Emergency response rooms fall outside of that, being that they were a reflexive reaction to the emergency of war. So that's it. Humanitarian organizations stood there for a very long time, hemming and hawing and wringing their hands, trying to figure out what to do, while everyone else who cared begged them to get it together, including this report from last December from an organization called Humanitarian Outcomes. Aid agencies must be willing to depart from current approaches and seek new partners, modalities, and entry points to the country in order to expand the reach of assistance. Eventually, aid orgs conceded that if they wanted to actually fulfill their mandate, they had to find a way to work with the emergency response rooms. But that took a really long time. And in the words of the iconic Kimberly Sweet Brown Wilkins, ain't nobody got time for that. So the ERRs continue to be hard at work, operative word being hard, with nowhere near enough resources to tackle a humanitarian crisis of this magnitude. Not to brag or anything, but it is known as the worst humanitarian crisis on planet Earth right now. So where do they get the resources they do have from? Well, for the most part, the ERRs are financially supported by the diaspora, who's been funneling donations into the country since the war began. But the diaspora is buckling under that weight because most people have also had to financially carry their families, their relatives, their extended families for almost 2 years now. And with the way the Sudan crisis is so underreported, collecting donations has been, to put it nicely, a struggle. At the local level, securing supplies has been incredibly difficult. It's not just the widespread destruction and mass looting. Production and supply chains have been severely compromised by this war, leading to nationwide shortages. And even when supplies are available, disrupted shipment routes and a wartime economy have made prices skyrocket. So sometimes the stuff is there, but nobody can afford it. All of that combined with the wider reality that many cities and towns are living under siege, with blockades imposed on supply supplies coming in. So emergency response rooms have had to take great risks to secure essentials like food and medicine for the communities in their care. You know, volunteers inside and outside the conflict zones have been living and working in an incredibly charged climate. They are caught in the literal crossfire and also the figurative crossfire of you're either with us or against us. It's an environment that leaves no room for neutrality. Volunteers have often found themselves accused of conspiring with either one side or the other in the conflict. And over the last 600 days, they've been abducted, detained, tortured, and killed. See, what sets this grassroots movement apart, especially within the Sudanese context, is that it is completely independent, untainted by politics or agenda. It is the secret to its success, and the reason why the emergency response rooms have garnered such a level of acceptance, support, and legitimacy from the Sudanese people. This level of trust also keeps emergency response rooms under incredible scrutiny, not just by our overlords, but also by the general public. And because of that, they are very intentional about how they navigate this work, meticulous in their reporting and in their record keeping. And so in many ways, that makes them a threat. The volunteers of the emergency response rooms, in all of their diversity, their robust network, their level of organization, their transparency, their unwavering dedication to this country, they represent something that has always terrified those in power: the unbridled and limitless potential and power of the people.